The cell smelled like rust and something worse, something chemical that burned the back of her throat every time she took a breath. Sergeant Rhea Vasquez sat on the cold metal floor with her back against the wall and her eyes closed, not because she was sleeping but because she was counting. She counted the footsteps of the guards outside her door, the rhythm of the flickering lights above, the seconds between each deep vibration that ran through the station walls like a heartbeat. She had been doing this for 3 days now, ever since they dragged her out of the wreckage of her transport shuttle and threw her into this box. The Carvas Ring was not a place anyone wanted to end up. It was a massive orbital station that circled a dying red star, a place where a dozen species came to trade and gamble and settle their ugliest disputes in ways that no proper government would ever allow. The arena sat at the heart of it all, a pit of sand and stone and dried blood where creatures fought and crowds screamed and fortunes changed hands in seconds. Rhea had heard stories about it back on Earth, the kind of stories soldiers told each other late at night to make the galaxy feel more dangerous than it already was. She never thought she would see it from the inside. The door opened with a hiss and 2 guards stepped in, both of them Velic, tall insect-like creatures with hard shells and too many eyes. One of them tossed a bundle of cloth at her feet. "Put it on," it said through its translator, the words flat and emotionless. Rhea stood and unrolled the cloth. It was a thin fighting tunic, gray, no armor, no padding, nothing but fabric. She pulled it over her head without a word. The second guard held something out to her, and when she saw it, her stomach dropped and then tightened into something harder than fear. It was her knife. Her kabar, 7 inches of blackened steel with a leather-wrapped handle worn smooth by years of use. She had carried it through 2 combat deployments, used it to cut wire and pry open panels, and once to dig a piece of shrapnel out of her own leg on a moon whose name she could not even pronounce. "They are letting you keep your little claw," the first guard said, and she could hear the amusement even through the translator's dead tone. "For morale." Rhea took the knife and held it for a moment, feeling its weight, and then she tested the edge against her thumb. Still sharp. She slid it into the loop on her belt and said nothing. The guards led her through a series of corridors that got louder with every turn, the sound of the crowd growing from a hum to a roar to something that shook the air itself. They passed through a final door, and she stepped into the prep chamber, a wide room with sand on the floor and weapon racks on the walls, all of them empty except for the sad collection of blunt training tools that no one ever used. A screen on the wall showed the arena above, and on it she could see the crowd for the first time. Thousands of them. Aliens of every shape and size packed into rising seats that curved around a wide circular pit of packed sand and broken stone, the whole thing lit by harsh white lights that made everything look sharp and merciless. At the center of the pit stood a figure that made Rhea stop walking. He was enormous. 9 feet tall at least, built like something between a gorilla and a tank, with 4 massive arms and skin covered in overlapping plates of bone that looked like natural armor. His head was broad and flat with a heavy jaw full of tusks, and his eyes were small and black and set deep beneath a ridge of solid bone. Gorvan the Unbroken. She had heard the name on the way to the prep chamber, whispered by other prisoners who looked at her with pity. 42 fights, 42 victories, not a single loss. He had killed creatures twice his size, torn limbs from bodies, broken spines with his bare hands. And he had chosen her as his next opponent. Specifically her. Specifically a human. Because humans were small and soft and breakable, and killing one in front of a crowd would be easy and entertaining, and over in less than a minute. Rhea watched him on the screen as he raised all 4 arms to the crowd, and soaked in their adoration like sunlight. She took a slow breath and began to stretch. She rolled her neck, loosened her shoulders, touched her toes, worked her ankles in small circles the way she always did before a run. The guards watched her with what might have been confusion. A horn sounded, deep and long, and the arena doors began to open. Light poured in, white and blinding, and the noise of the crowd hit her like a wall of sound. Rhea walked forward into it. The sand was coarse under her boots, and the air was dry and hot from the lights above. She could see Gorvan clearly now, standing at the far end of the arena, and he was even bigger in person than he had looked on the screen. He saw her too. He saw the knife on her belt. And he laughed. It was a deep booming sound that rolled across the arena like thunder, genuine and full of real amusement. Not cruel exactly, but so far beyond taking her seriously that cruelty would have almost been more respectful. He pointed at her blade and turned to the crowd, and said something in his own language that the arena speakers translated a moment later. "I have eaten meals that fought harder than this." The crowd roared with laughter, and Rhea felt every eye in the station land on her like a physical weight. She did not react. She pulled the knife from her belt and flipped it into a reverse grip, the blade running along the back of her forearm, and she planted her feet in the sand. But her eyes were not on Gorvan. They were moving, scanning, reading the arena the way she read a construction site, the way she read any environment she was about to take apart and rebuild. She saw the stone pillars spaced unevenly across the pit, the suspended platforms hanging from chains above, the flickering energy barriers that hummed on and off at regular intervals along the edges. She saw the gaps between the pillars, the shadows beneath the platforms, the timing of the barriers. She saw geometry. She saw angles and distances, and choke points and timing windows. She saw a weapon system that no one else in the arena even recognized as one. The bell rang, sharp and final, and Gorvan charged. The ground shook under his weight, all four arms spread wide, his mouth open in a battle roar that rattled her ribs. Rhea did not run toward him. She turned and ran sideways, fast and low, straight toward the obstacle course. The crowd booed, a wall of angry sound that said coward and prey and dead already. Gorvan grinned and adjusted his charge, his confidence so total that he did not even speed up. He thought she was running away. He was wrong. Rhea reached the first pillar and cut behind it, her mind already 3 moves ahead, already building a map, already turning stone and chain and light into the only language she had ever truly spoken. The language of engineering. And she was about to give Gorvan the unbroken, the most brutal lesson of his life. Gorvan followed her into the obstacle course at a walk, not a run, because he did not believe she deserved a run. His 4 arms swung loose at his sides, and his bone-plated face wore an expression that every species in the galaxy would have recognized as bored amusement. The crowd was still booing, but their voices had shifted into something more like impatient hunger, waiting for the moment when the big one caught the small one and turned her into a stain on the sand. Rhea heard none of it. She was deep inside her own mind now, in the cold, quiet place where numbers lived, where the world stopped being shapes and colors and became measurements and probabilities. She crouched behind the second pillar and watched Gorvan approach through a gap in the stone. He was 12 feet away, then 10, then 8. She counted his steps and measured his stride, and noted the way his upper arms led his movement, while his lower arms stayed closer to his body for balance. She noted the slight roll in his left hip, probably an old injury that never healed right, and the way his bone plates overlapped at his joints with tiny gaps where the edges did not quite meet. She noted everything. Gorvan rounded the pillar and swung with his upper right arm, a casual backhand that would have taken her head off if it had landed. But Rhea was already gone, slipping under the swing and darting between 2 pillars that stood close together, close enough for her to pass through at full speed but too narrow for his massive frame. Gorvan turned and followed, shoving his bulk between the pillars, and for half a second his body wedged tight. Half a second. Rhea was already coming back. She lunged in low and fast, and drew the kabar across the back of his lower left knee, right through the gap between 2 bone plates. and she felt the blade bite into something softer than armor. Then she was gone again, sprinting along the base of a hanging platform and disappearing into shadow. Gorvan let out a sound that was not quite a roar and not quite a scream, something between surprise and fury that shook dust from the chains above. He pulled himself free from the pillars and looked down at his knee. Blood. Dark blue blood, thick as oil, running down his leg and dripping into the sand. The cut was only 4 inches long and not very deep, barely a scratch by Drelith standards, but it was there. He was bleeding. For the first time in 11 bouts, something had opened his skin. The crowd went quiet for one perfect heartbeat, and then they erupted, not in boos this time but in the sharp electric sound of genuine shock. Gorvan wiped the blood with one of his lower hands and looked at it, then looked in the direction Rhea had vanished, and for the first time his expression changed. The amusement was still there, but something else had joined it, a flicker of irritation, a tiny crack in the wall of his confidence. He growled and moved forward, faster now, smashing through the obstacle course with heavy, deliberate strides. Rhea let him come. She moved through the course like water through pipes, flowing along paths that her mind had already mapped 3 steps ahead. She used the flickering energy barriers like doors, timing her movements to slip through gaps that existed for only a second before the barrier hummed back to life. Gorvan could not follow through them. He was too big, too slow, and every time he tried to circle around she was already somewhere else. 30 seconds after the first cut she came in again, dropping from a platform above, and opened a gash across the back of his upper right hand before rolling away under a chain. 40 seconds later she darted out from behind a broken pillar and slashed the soft membrane under his left armpit, where no bone plate covered the skin. 20 seconds after that she came from below, sliding on the sand, and drove the blade into the flesh between 2 plates on his lower right thigh. Every strike was fast and precise and shallow, and in a different place. She never hit the same area twice. She never stayed in range for more than a second. She never gave him a target. Gorvan was furious now, truly furious, and his attacks had become wilder, his swings wider, his roars louder. He was tearing the course apart trying to reach her, ripping chains from their anchors and hurling chunks of stone that shattered against the walls. But fury was not accuracy, and power was not speed, and every time he overcommitted to a swing, he left a gap somewhere on his body that Rhea had already identified and catalogued. She cut him there. Then she was gone. In the stands above, a Morathi veteran who had served in 3 interstellar wars leaned toward his companion and spoke in a voice that was very quiet and very serious. "She is not fighting him," he said. "She is running a targeting algorithm." His companion, a young Morathi who had come to the arena for entertainment, looked down at the pit with wide eyes and said nothing. The crowd had changed. They were no longer booing or laughing or screaming for blood in the usual way. They were watching, truly watching, the way you watch something you do not fully understand but can feel is important. Gorvan stood in the center of the ruined obstacle course and breathed hard through his tusks. He had 14 wounds now. 14 cuts across his body, on his knees and hands and arms and sides and thighs, each one bleeding that dark blue blood into the sand beneath him. None of them were deep enough to be dangerous on their own. But together they were a map, a constellation of pain drawn by a hand that knew exactly where to put each star. He was slower now. Not by much, but enough for someone who was counting, and Rhea was always counting. She stood on a platform above him, breathing hard but controlled, her tunic dark with sweat and splashes of his blue blood. She looked down at him and there was nothing personal in her eyes, no anger, no triumph, no fear. She looked at him the way she looked at a blueprint when she was searching for the next load-bearing wall to reinforce, or the next stress point that would bring the whole structure down if she hit it right. She looked at him like a problem that was halfway solved. Gorvan looked up at her, and for the first time in 42 fights, he did not know what to do next. He had fought creatures with claws the length of swords and jaws that could crush metal and venom, that could melt bone. None of them had confused him like this. None of them had made him feel like the ground beneath his feet was slowly and carefully being taken away from him 1 inch at a time. He bared his tusks and snarled up at her, but the snarl had a question in it now, a question he had never had to ask before. "What are you doing to me?" Rhea did not answer. She shifted her grip on the knife and dropped from the platform, landing soft on the sand, and began to circle him again. Slow, patient, reading every twitch of his muscles and every shift of his weight like words on a page. The algorithm was still running, and it was almost finished. Gorvan was a champion for a reason. He had not won 42 fights by being stupid, and he had not survived this long by refusing to learn. So when Rhea landed on the sand and began to circle him again, something shifted behind those small black eyes, something cold and calculating that had nothing to do with Ray. He stopped chasing her. He turned to the nearest pillar, wrapped 2 of his massive arms around it, and ripped it out of the ground. The stone screamed as it came free, a sound like bones breaking, and Gorvan hurled the entire pillar across the arena where it shattered against the far wall in an explosion of dust and rock. Then he grabbed the next one. And the next. He tore platforms from their chains and sent them crashing to the sand, yanked the chain anchors out of the ceiling, and whipped them across the ground like metal serpents, stomped the smaller obstacles into rubble beneath his feet. The crowd screamed with delight as the obstacle course that Rhea had turned into her fortress was destroyed piece by piece, reduced to nothing but scattered stone and twisted metal on flat, open sand. Rhea watched from behind the last standing pillar as her advantage was ripped away from her. Every angle she had memorized, every gap and shadow and timing window she had mapped in her mind, all of it was gone in less than a minute. Gorvan finished his destruction and stood in the center of the ruined arena, breathing hard, blue blood still running from his 14 wounds, and he looked directly at her. There was no more amusement in his eyes. There was only the cold focus of a predator that had finally decided to take its prey seriously. He charged. Not the lazy, confident charge from before, but a real one, all 4 arms driving him forward, his bone plates rattling with each impact of his feet against the sand. Rhea ran, but there was nowhere to go, no pillars to cut behind, no platforms to climb, no barriers to slip through. Just open sand and a monster that was closing the distance fast. His lower left arm caught her across the back as she tried to dodge right, and the impact was like being hit by a car. She flew forward and rolled across the sand, her body bouncing once, twice, and she came to a stop face down with the taste of copper flooding her mouth. 2 ribs. She felt them go, a sharp wet snap on her left side that sent lightning up through her chest. The crowd erupted in a roar that shook the arena walls, because this was what they had paid for. This was the spectacle they had come to see. Rhea pushed herself up on shaking arms and spat blood onto the sand. The knife was still in her hand. She had not dropped it, not even when she was tumbling through the air, because her fingers had locked around that leather handle with a grip that went deeper than conscious thought. Gorvan was already coming. She got to her feet just in time to twist away from a downward slam that cratered the sand where she had been lying, and she stumbled backward, trying to find her footing, trying to breathe through the broken glass feeling in her ribs. He swung again, upper right, and she ducked it, but his lower right came in behind it and clipped her shoulder. The joint popped out of its socket with a sound like a branch snapping, and her left arm went dead, hanging loose and useless at her side. The pain was enormous, a white-hot scream that ran from her shoulder to her fingertips, and for one terrible second her vision went gray and she almost fell. She did not fall. She grabbed her own left wrist with her right hand, the one still holding the knife. And she braced her feet and wrenched her shoulder back into its socket. The sound it made was something no one in that arena would forget, a wet grinding crunch that echoed off the walls, and Rhea screamed, a raw animal sound torn from somewhere deep in her chest. Then she stopped screaming and raised the knife again. The crowd went quiet. Not silent, but quiet. The way a room gets quiet when something happens that does not fit into any of the stories people have told themselves about how the world works. Gorvan pressed his advantage. He was smart enough to know that he needed to end this now while she was hurt and slow. He came at her with a combination, upper arms swinging wide to cut off her escape, while his lower arms jabbed at her center, and Rhea could not dodge all of it. She took a hit to the hip that spun her sideways, and a glancing blow across her back that drove the air from her lungs. But she was inside his reach now, close to his body where his long arms had less power, and even broken and bleeding, she was still faster than him at this reign. She drove the kabar into the gap between the plates on his lower right forearm and twisted, and Gorvan bellowed and pulled back, and when he did the blade opened a 6-inch wound that ran along the inside of his arm like a zipper. He kicked her, a straight thrust with his massive leg, and it caught her in the stomach and sent her flying backward into what was left of a stone wall. She hit it hard enough to crack the stone and slid down to the sand, gasping, her vision swimming. Blood ran from a gash on her forehead where her head had struck the wall, a red curtain that she had to keep blinking out of her right eye. In his viewing box above the arena, the broker shifted in his seat. His long insectoid fingers tapped against the arm of his chair, in a pattern that his assistants recognized as anxiety. This was supposed to be an execution, a quick and profitable show that would last 2 minutes at most. It had been 9 minutes, and the human was still alive. His odds makers were screaming into their communicators, trying to adjust the betting lines that were swinging wildly as money poured in from species that had never bet on a human before. Gorvan crossed the arena toward her in 4 massive strides and reached down with his upper right arm and closed his hand around her throat. He lifted her off the ground like she weighed nothing, and she probably did to him, and he squeezed. Rhea choked, her feet kicking in the air, her right hand still gripping the knife but pinned against her own chest by the angle of his arm. He brought her close to his face, close enough that she could see the texture of his bone plates and smell the metallic tang of his blue blood and feel the heat of his breath against her skin. "Enough," he said, and his voice was low and final and almost gentle in the way that very powerful things are gentle when they have decided to stop playing. Die with what little honor your species can claim. Rhea's vision was going dark at the edges, a tunnel closing in, and she could feel her heartbeat in her ears getting slower as his grip crushed the blood flow to her brain. She had seconds left. Maybe less. She looked into his small black eyes from inches away, and she saw confidence there, the absolute certainty of a creature that had never been beaten, that could not imagine a universe in which it lost. She shifted the knife in her hand, a tiny movement that cost her everything she had left, and she found the angle she had been mapping since the moment he picked her up. The soft gap beneath his jaw, where the bone plates of his skull did not quite meet the plates of his neck, a space no wider than 2 fingers. She drove the kabar into it. Not deep enough to kill. She did not have the strength left for that, but deep enough to reach the nerve cluster that sat behind the joint of his jaw, the one that controlled his upper right arm. She knew it was there because she had spent 9 minutes studying every part of his body, and she had seen the way the muscles of that arm connected to the tendons that ran up his neck. 7 inches of blackened steel sank into the gap and found the nerve. Gorvan's upper right arm went dead. His fingers opened like a flower and Rhea dropped from his grip and hit the sand in a crouch, gasping, sucking in air that burned her broken ribs like fire. She pulled the knife free as she fell, and a spray of dark blue blood followed it. Gorvan staggered backward, his dead arm hanging limp, his eyes wide with something that no one in the arena had ever seen on his face before. Rhea stood up, slowly, painfully, with blood running from her forehead and her shoulders screaming, and her ribs grinding with every breath. She stood up and raised the knife. The arena was silent, completely and absolutely silent. 10,000 aliens staring down at a small, broken human woman standing in the sand with a 7-inch blade and refusing to die. And for the first time in 42 fights, Gorvan the Unbroken took a step backward. Gorvan looked at his dead arm the way a man might look at the sun going out, with a confusion so deep it bordered on disbelief. He flexed the fingers and nothing happened, sent the command to lift the elbow and nothing happened, and the arm just hung there at his side like a piece of meat on a hook, useless and heavy and wrong. He had 4 arms his entire life. Now he had 3. And the thing that had taken the 4th was standing 10 feet away from him, swaying on her feet, covered in red blood and blue blood and dust, with 2 broken ribs and a shoulder that had been torn apart and put back together in the span of a single scream. She should be dead. Any creature in the known galaxy would be dead or at least down, curled up on the sand and waiting for the killing blow. But Rhea Vasquez was not any creature. She was human. And humans had a quality that the rest of the galaxy had never understood and never named because they had never needed to. A quality that had nothing to do with strength or speed or size. They did not stop. They could be hurt and broken and beaten into the ground and they would get back up, not because they were too stupid to know they were losing, but because something inside them, something old and deep and woven into the very fabric of their DNA, simply refused to accept that the fight was over until their heart stopped beating. Rhea began to walk toward Gorvan. Not running, not charging, just walking, 1 foot in front of the other, steady and slow, the knife held loose in her right hand. The crowd watched in silence. There was something about the way she moved that changed the air in the arena, something that made 10,000 aliens from dozens of species feel a chill they could not explain. It was not impressive in the way Gorvan was impressive. There was no display of power, no flexing of muscle, no roar of dominance. It was worse than that. It was the calm, patient walk of something that had already decided how this was going to end. Gorvan swung at her with his upper left arm, a massive haymaker that would have shattered stone, and Rhea did not dodge it the way she had been dodging before. She stepped into it. She moved forward at an angle that put her just inside the arc of his swing, so that his forearm passed over her head instead of through it. And as she stepped, she drew the blade across the inside of his upper left elbow, right through the gap in his plates that she had identified 7 minutes ago and had been waiting to use. The cut was deep this time. Gorvan howled and pulled the arm back, and when he did the movement was wrong, slower than it should have been, because she had severed something important inside the joint. 3 arms became 2.5. He swung with his lower arms, both at once, a desperate horizontal sweep meant to crush her between them like a clap, and Rhea dropped flat to the sand and let them pass over her, and then rolled forward between his legs. She came up behind him and put the knife into the back of his lower right knee, the same spot she had cut in the first minute of the fight, but deeper now, much deeper, and Gorvan's leg buckled. He stumbled forward and caught himself on his one fully working arm and spun around to face her, but she was already moving, already circling to his left, where his damaged upper arm could not protect him. She knew his body now. She knew it the way she knew a machine she had spent hours taking apart and putting back together. She knew that when he swung with his upper left, his weight shifted to his right foot, and his lower right arm dropped 2 inches to compensate for the balance chain. She knew that when he guarded his throat with his lower arms, his stance widened, and the wound on his inner thigh opened up and became a gap she could reach. She knew that when he kicked with his right leg, he left a half-second window where his left side was completely unguarded because his damaged arm could not rotate fast enough to cover it. She knew all of this because she had spent every second of this fight being hit and thrown and choked and broken, while simultaneously building a complete mechanical model of his body inside her mind. Every wound she had taken had bought her information. Every impact had taught her something. And now the lesson was over, and the exam had begun. She cut him, again and again and again. Not wild, desperate slashes, but precise surgical strikes delivered to exact location that she had chosen before she even moved toward them. She opened the other knee, and he dropped to the sand. She sliced the tendon on his remaining good upper arm, and it weakened, not enough to disable but enough to slow his swings by a fraction of a second, that she then used to cut him somewhere else. She put the blade into the soft gap between his ribs on the left side, where a cluster of blood vessels ran close to the surface, and his breathing changed, became wet and ragged and labored. It was not a fight anymore. It was target practice. She had spent the entire bout mapping his body the way she mapped a construction site, identifying every weakness, every structural flaw, every point where a small, precise application of force would cause the maximum amount of damage. And now she was running through the map with the efficiency of someone who had built things and broken things her entire adult life, and knew exactly how much pressure it took to make something that was still standing finally fall. Gorvan dropped to one knee, then the other. He was on his knees in the sand, all four arms hanging at various degrees of useless, his bone plates dark with his own blood, his breathing a wet rattle that sprayed blue mist with every exhale. He had lost too much blood, not from any single wound, but from the accumulated total of more than 20 cuts that had been placed with an understanding of his circulatory system that no enemy had ever taken the time to develop. He looked up at Rhea. She stood before him, swaying slightly, her face a mask of blood and bruises, her left arm pressed against her broken ribs, the kabar in her right hand so soaked in blue blood that the blackened steel looked like it had been dipped in ink. She was in terrible shape. Any doctor in the galaxy would have put her in critical care, would have listed the broken ribs and the damaged shoulder and the concussion and the internal bruising and the blood loss and shaken their head and said it was a miracle she was still conscious. But she was not just conscious. She was standing. And he was not. Gorvan looked up into her eyes, and he saw something there that he had never seen in 42 fights. Not in the eyes of warriors twice his size or beasts with claws like swords or venomous killers, bred for nothing but murder. He saw patience. Not the patience of someone waiting for an opportunity, but the patience of something ancient and fundamental. The patience of a species that had evolved on a planet where the way you killed something bigger than you was not by being stronger or faster, but by following it and bleeding it and wearing it down step by step over hours and days until it could not run anymore. He saw the persistence predator. And for the first time in his life, he was afraid. A whisper rippled through the crowd, starting in the lower seats and rising up through the tears like wind through grass. It was not cheering. It was not booing. It was something much quieter and much more powerful than either of those things. It was awe. In his viewing box, the broker leaned forward, and his insectoid hands were shaking as he activated the arena microphone. "The match is concluded," he announced, his translator struggling to keep his voice steady. "By ruling of the arena authority, this bout is declared a draw. Both combatants have demonstrated sufficient." He kept talking, but no one was listening. Because down on the sand, Rhea had not moved. She stood over Gorvan with the knife in her hand, and the broker's words floating past her like dust in the wind. She looked up at the viewing box. Then she looked down at Gorvan, and the entire arena held its breath. The broker's voice echoed through the arena speakers, declaring the draw over and over as if repetition could make it true. But Rhea stood perfectly still with the knife in her hand and looked down at the creature kneeling in front of her. Gorvan's blood was pooling around his knees, soaking into the sand in a dark blue stain that kept spreading, and his breathing came in short, wet bursts that shook his entire body. His eyes were still open, still aware, and they were locked on the woman who had taken him apart piece by piece with 7 inches of steel. The arena was so quiet that Rhea could hear the hum of the energy barriers at the edges of the pit, still flickering on and off like they did not know the fight was over. She looked at the knife in her hand. It was completely blue now, every inch of the blade coated in Draelith blood, and the leather handle was slick with a mix of his blood and hers. She could finish it. One thrust into the gap beneath his jaw, deeper this time, all the way through the nerve cluster and into the brain stem, and Gorvan the Unbroken would become Gorvan the Dead. It would take less than a second. She had earned it. Every broken rib, every dislocated shoulder, every moment of choking in his grip with her vision going dark, all of it pointed toward this one clean ending. She did not do it. She slid the knife back into the loop on her belt and took a step backward. A sound went through the crowd, not a gasp exactly, but something like the sound 1,000 beings make when they all exhale at the same time. Gorvan stared at her, and his expression was something that translators could not process and words could not hold, a mixture of confusion and relief, and something that might have been the beginning of respect. "Why?" he said, and his voice was a broken rasp that barely carried past his own teeth. Rhea looked at him for a long moment, and when she spoke her voice was calm and quiet, and carried no anger at all. "Because killing you ends the story with your death," she said. "Letting you live means you tell it." The translation systems picked up her words and broadcast them across the arena in 50 different languages simultaneously, and she watched the understanding ripple through the crowd like a wave. She had not spared him out of mercy. She had spared him out of strategy. A dead champion was a footnote, a body on the sand that would be forgotten by the next fight night. A living champion who had been broken by a human with a knife. That was a story that would travel to every station and colony and homeworld in the sector. That was a message. Gorvan understood. She could see it in his eyes, the moment the realization landed, and something in his face changed, the last remnants of pride crumbling away to reveal something raw and honest beneath. "What are you?" he asked, and it was not the angry demand he had snarled at her earlier when he had her by the throat. It was a genuine question from a being who had been shown something that did not fit into his understanding of the universe. Rhea leaned down so that her face was close to his, close enough that only he could hear her over the hum of the arena. "I am a combat engineer," she said. "I was not even infantry." She straightened up and turned her back to him and walked toward the arena gate. The translation systems had picked up those words too, every syllable, and they played across the arena in 50 languages, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing Rhea had ever heard in her life. Then the murmuring started. Thousands of voices at once, not cheering, not booing, just talking. A rising tide of urgent, frantic conversation as every being in the arena processed the same impossible thought. This was not a soldier from their warrior class. This was not a trained killer or a champion or a death specialist bred and raised for combat. This was a builder, a constructor of bridges and walls and infrastructure. Someone whose primary job was to make things rather than destroy them. And she had done this. She had walked into an arena with nothing but a 7-inch blade and taken apart an undefeated giant like a machine with a design flaw. What then could their actual soldiers do? That question hung in the air like smoke, unspoken but felt by every species in the Karvas ring, and it changed things in ways that would take months and years to fully reveal themselves. Rhea walked through the gate and into the corridor beyond, and the doors closed behind her, and she made it exactly 14 steps before her legs gave out. She hit the floor hard and lay there on the cold metal with her cheek pressed against the grating, breathing in shallow, careful breaths that worked around the broken glass in her ribs. A medical team arrived, not for her but for Gorvan, and they ran right past her through the gate into the arena. A second team came later and found her on the floor, and they worked on her in the corridor because she could not be moved. She stared at the ceiling and let them work and did not make a sound. 3 weeks later, she was ransomed back to human space as part of a prisoner exchange that went through faster than anyone expected, because the authorities on the Karvas ring suddenly seemed very motivated to return their human captives in good condition. Gorvan survived. The medical teams rebuilt what they could and patched what they could not, and he walked out of the arena medical bay on his own legs with all 4 arms mostly functional, but he never fought again. He refused every challenge, turned down every offer, ignored every insult meant to provoke him back into the pit. When other warriors asked him why, he said nothing. When diplomats and reporters and academics came to him and asked what it had been like to fight a human, he went very still and very quiet, and he said only one thing: "Do not laugh at their small blades." The fight footage was released by the broker's office 3 days after the bout, packaged as premium entertainment content with a price tag that reflected the unprecedented demand. It sold more copies in one cycle than any arena fight in the history of the Karvas ring. But it did not spread as entertainment. Military academies on 3 different homeworlds acquired copies and stripped the footage down frame by frame, analyzing every movement and every cut and every decision. The Morathi War College added it to their officer training curriculum under a new module titled Persistence, Predation, and Adaptive Lethality, the Human Threat Model. The Draelith High Command issued a classified advisory to their fleet commanders that was later leaked to the galactic press and contained a single recommendation: do not engage human forces in prolonged ground operations under any circumstances. The Velic Intelligence Directorate commissioned a study on human endurance psychology that took 2 years to complete and whose final report was summarized in a single sentence: they do not stop. Human diplomatic leverage in the sector increased by 14% over the following cycle, and no official could explain exactly why, but everyone knew. Everyone had seen the footage. Everyone had watched a small woman with a tiny knife stand over a giant on his knees and choose to let him live because the story of his survival was more useful than the satisfaction of his death. That was the part that frightened them the most. Not the fighting, not the bleeding, not the impossible stubborn refusal to die. The part that frightened them was the strategy. She had been thinking that far ahead while being beaten half to death. Rhea returned to her engineering unit on the border station, where she had been assigned before her capture. Her commanding officer met her in the corridor and asked if she was all right, and she nodded and said she was fine and asked if there was anything on her workload that needed attention. He told her the bridge project on Sigma 7 was behind schedule, and she said she would take a look at it. She sat down at her workstation and pulled up the bridge schematic on her screen and began to work through the structural calculations with the same quiet focus she had carried into the arena. On her desk, next to a cold cup of coffee and a stack of engineering manuals, the Kabar sat in its sheath. Clean, oiled, 7 inches of blackened steel that had changed the way an entire sector thought about the human race. Rhea worked through her calculations and did not look at it. She did not need to. 2 galactic cycles later, a xenoanthropology textbook was published by the University of Karvas that became required reading at 17 academic institutions across the sector. The final chapter dealt with humanity, and it opened with a passage that was quoted so often it became something close to a proverb among the species of the Outer Rim. The human species does not specialize, it read. They build no natural weapons, grow no armor, develop no venom, achieve no great size, and yet they sit at the apex of their home planet's food chain and have done so for 100,000 years. This lack of specialization is frequently mistaken for a weakness by species that have invested their evolutionary capital into singular biological advantages. It is, in fact, the most dangerous thing about them. Because a creature that specializes can be understood, predicted, and ultimately countered. A creature that refuses to specialize, that adapts and learns and builds and bleeds and simply will not stop, cannot be countered at all. It can only be survived.